Please mute your microphone. Otherwise, there will be a lot of disturbances and we will not be able to complete it successfully. So please mute your microphone and don't talk or produce any sounds between the seminar. Then today, we are on the last day of this webinar series on COVID-19 and update being organized from AIIMS Bhubaneswar. I again extend my hearty welcome to all of you and to join this seminar. We have two interesting sessions today. One is on the management of severe COVID-19 disease and what will be our ventilatory strategy to manage patients who requires ventilatory care and develops ARDS and all those things. So I hope this is audible to all of you. Hello.
Yes.
Yes, audible.
Yeah,
Audible, sir.
Thank
Very
you.
nice.
Thank you. So we have already discussed the basic things from the beginning, like overview of the virus, how to diagnose, what are the infection prevention control measures, donning and doffing, and the management of mild COVID-19 diseases. So my job is to discuss about the management of severe COVID-19 diseases, and this will be followed by management of ARDS and ventilatory management of severe COVID-19 by Dr. Satyajit Misra, who is the additional professor of anesthesiology in our institute. So let's begin. Yeah. So at the outset, let me clarify the objectives. So what we hope that at the end of these sessions, one should be able to understand the clinical spectrum of COVID-19 illness. One should be in a position to recognize what actually is called as a severe COVID-19 disease. One should be able to identify the risk factors for severe disease. And last but not the least, then a clinician should be in a position to decide and plan a possible treatment strategy for managing such patients. So these are the broad objectives of today's seminar. So how does COVID-19 present and what are the various spectrum or clinical manifestations it can have? What we understood so far, that a COVID-19 disease can be as mild, as simple as a common cold, which is usually called as uncomplicated illness. Usually the patients will present with simple flu-like symptoms like fever, myalgia, headache, rhinorrhea, all these things, but there will be no other warning signs and symptoms like dyspnea or desaturations. The next spectrum is a mild pneumonia, where we can see radiologically a patch can be detected either in the chest X-ray or by a HRCT scan. Most of the people who will be having mild pneumonia, they will be usually having a HRCT detectable patch rather than a very obvious patch on the chest X-ray, and they do not fulfill the criteria of a severe pneumonia like having a respiratory rate of more than 30 or having a room air desaturations. The next category of patients what we can found is severe pneumonia, where the patients definitely require hospital admissions and management. And the last spectrum, though it could be a 3 different groups we can classify like ARDS, sepsis and septic shock, but all these 3 can be combinedly called as the critical illness. So this is the next group, how a patient of COVID-19 can present to us. It may so happen that a patient can present initially with an uncomplicated form of disease or a mild form of disease and may progress to any of the severe form, or it may be like that the patient itself presented from the beginning with a very severe form of the disease. Any type of presentation is possible. But what is severe pneumonia? When we will call that it is a severe COVID-19 pneumonia. This is in the context of a patient where we have already documented COVID-19 disease by proving a positive result by an RT-PCR, or a strong suspicion is there. So anybody who is coming with a fever or suspected respiratory infections, plus any one of the following, like a respiratory rate of more than 30, or a severe respiratory distress, and room air desaturations, when we measure by a pulse oximetry, that is showing at less than 90%. So these are the criteria when one should suspect a severe pneumonia and be very vigilant to monitor such group of patients. In general, what we have known so far, based on the published literature, mostly from the China, one of the largest epidemiological series that included more than 40,000 confirmed cases. What we know so far is majority of the diseases, fortunately, are of mild nature, that constitutes somewhere around 81%. And this group of people actually do not require any intensive care management or any, even most of the time they may get well of their own even if we do not hospitalize them. The next spectrum is the severe disease, which is the core focus of my topic, and the critical diseases will be taken up by my subsequent speaker. Severe disease and critical disease, if I combine together, they roughly constitute the 20% of the illnesses, out of which 14 to 15% of the patients will come with a severe disease, which will be having the hypoxia and radiological evidence of pneumonia. In this series from China, the case fatality rate, overall case fatality rate was 2.3%. But if we divide it into different age groups, obviously the elderly are more likely to die than the younger, and the case fatality reaches up to 15-16% depending upon the age, even up to more than 25-30% if they are of the extreme age, like more than 90, and so that we will be subsequently discussing. And no death has been reported among the mild cases in various publications across the nations. If we see the different risk factors for severe illnesses, these are the established risk factors so far what we understand from the epidemiological studies, like cardiovascular diseases, hypertension, diabetes, chronic lung diseases, cancer, chronic kidney disease, chronic liver disease, immunocompromised state, and of course a high BMI. So these are the known risk factors as of now. Another article which actually dealt with the incidence of thrombosis, and they analyzed with the age. And as we see from this graph, as the age increases, the chance of survival progressively decreases. And particularly, once you cross the age of 60, there is a sharp rise in the chances of dying. So age also seems to be an independent predictor of survival as well as the possible severity of the disease. Again, another article talks about, particularly, this is an article which specifically looks into the effect of age on the different clinical, laboratory, and radiological parameters of COVID-19. If we divide the patients between two age groups, like less than 60 and more than 60, we can see from this slide that all the parameters, like the clinical parameters, laboratory parameters, the radiological parameters, are actually more worse, or rather worsen, in the people who are more than 60 years of age, including the management, like the people who are more than 60 years of age are requiring more antibiotics, and also the duration of hospitalizations is also more for people who are more than 60 years of age. What are the different ways or different clinical syndromes a severe COVID-19 disease can present with? Most common manifestations of COVID-19 disease is a pneumonia. So pneumonia will be very obvious with the clinical signs and the radiological appearance. Most people develop this severe pneumonia usually within a week of developing the symptoms, mostly within 10 days. And dyspnea is one of the important symptoms that heralds the onset of a possible severe pneumonia and ARDS. So somebody who comes with dyspnea, we have to take very, very vigilantly, and chest X-ray is definitely indicated in such patients. Acute respiratory distress syndrome has been noted in around 20 to 40% of cases. Around 12 to 14% of cases across different series, they'll end up in invasive mechanical ventilations, and various types of cardiac complications like arrhythmia and injury, like acute coronary syndrome and shock has been reported to various extent. If we go by another epidemiological study other than China, like one of the large study from New York City, in various hospitals in the New York City, what they have analyzed, including 5,700 patients with a median age of 63 years, the most common comorbidity what they found was hypertension. This was followed by obesity, and diabetes was the third common comorbidity in this population. Roughly 31% of the patients actually had fever at presentations. So we should not be in the misconception that fever should be a must to diagnose somebody as COVID-19 disease. Respiratory rate was more than 24 in around 18%, 17% of patients, and roughly around 28% of the patients needed oxygen supplementation at the time of presentations. That means this 28% could be possibly having the pneumonia or the severe pneumonia. Around 14% of patients needed ICU admissions, of which around 12% of the patients required invasive mechanical ventilations. The overall death reported is 21%, that is 553 patients out of 2634 patients, not out of 5700. It is out of 2634 patients the death has been reported, because the data, analyzable data was available for 2634 patients and not the complete 5700 patient, because the rest of the patients were yet to have any outcome. They were still in the hospital. So we do not know they will die or they will get discharged to home after being well. And if we see among the patients who went into the invasive mechanical ventilations, the overall mortality, even from a developed country like in the New York City, it was 88% once they land up in the invasive mechanical ventilation. And if we stratify into less than 65 or more than 65 year group, we found, or they found, that the people who are more than 65 years had a 97% chance of dying once they land up in mechanical ventilations. And people who were not mechanically ventilated, also there was a significant difference between the mortality between those who are less than 65 and those who are more than 65. But even in this largest series of 2,600 odd patients, there are no death reported those who were less than 18 years of age. So being young, it seems to be a boon so far COVID-19 disease is concerned. Let's come to the radiological discussions. What are the different ways a patient with COVID-19 can present? Chest X-ray wise also more or less, we will see a similar opacities like peripheral distributions, patchy opacities, and the classic ground glass opacity is one of the commonest presentations that has been noted over the last few months. What do we see? It could be unilateral or bilateral. If we go by the China studies and other studies also, around 70% of the patients will be having a bilateral shadow in the chest X-ray rather than unilateral shadows. So bilateral shadows are more common than unilateral shadows. Mostly it is ground glass opacity, mostly it is peripherally distributed, and mostly it is lower low predominant shadows. What are the various laboratory manifestations associated with COVID-19 disease that predicts or portends a poor outcome, like lymphopenia, elevated liver enzymes, elevated LDH, elevated inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein or ferritin, elevated D-dimer, especially more than one, elevated prothrombin time, troponin, creatinine kinase, and of course development of AKI. All these things are reported to be worse outcome. Among all these things, one thing which has been significantly or consistently reported in most of the studies are like the degree of lymphopenia correlates well with the degree of survival. Similarly, the D-dimer level. This has been also found to be a very significant prognosticator in most of the studies. Of late, there is an interesting phenomenon which is being noted in COVID-19 disease, especially the severe diseases, the increased incidences of thrombosis. And not only the venous thrombosis as well as arterial thrombosis and different thromboembolic events, including stroke and myocardial infarctions, has been reported in few studies. This is one study from Netherlands where among 184 patients, they found a thromboembolic event in 31 patients. And this proportion seems to be quite higher than normally what is expected in a ICU population. So in that way, COVID-19 itself could be an independent risk factor for developing a thromboembolic event. But again, this needs to be proven by further well-designed and controlled studies. These are mostly observational studies. And if we see from here, coagulopathy, some form of coagulopathy was present in 70% of the patients, in 70 patients, that is 38% of the patients when they presented to the hospital. And established risk of thrombosis like active cancer was present only in 2.7%. So rest of the patients, they do not have any established risk factor of thrombosis, and still a thrombosis was found in 31 patients. So this, and despite patients being on therapeutic anticoagulations also in around 9% of the patients. So this itself suggests that possibly thrombosis is being more prevalent among this group of patients. And to characterize the different thromboembolic events here, pulmonary embolism was found in 25 patients. Other forms of venous thromboembolism, like in the limb veins, it was found in 3. And arterial thrombosis was found in 3, that all led to the ischemic strokes. So this is something which needs to be considered whenever we see a poor outcome in patients. And these people who are dying suddenly, we do not know, we may be thinking it is simply respiratory failure, but the patient actually had developed an embolism. And it becomes very, very difficult to prove, considering the investigations that you require to diagnose or document such diseases like a CTPA. A CTPA may be a very cumbersome issue to do in such group of patients where you need so many infection prevention and control measures, and maybe sometimes you may need a dedicated CT scan for that, which may not be possible in a resource constrained setting like us or yours. So this is something which is dangerous things. In another study from Italy also, they also documented among 388 patients, 28 patients, they documented arteriovenous thrombosis, and 2.5% of the patients developed ischemic stroke, and around 1% of the patients developed myocardial infarctions. DIC was seen only in 8%, that is in 2.2%. That means DIC is not the only cause of thrombosis in these patients. Out of 28, only 8 patients had DIC. So rest 20 patients had venous or arterial thrombosis without evidence of DIC. This itself suggests that venous or arterial thrombosis is an independent phenomenon of severe COVID-19 disease, which needs to be again established by future trials. And if we see here, one of the important prognosticator or one of the important marker for a possible underlying thrombosis is the D dimer. Among the people who survived and who did not survive, if we see, the D dimer level was very, very high across the days to the 9 days. Like within the first 3 days also it was high, and at the end of 9 days also, the people who died had a very high level of D dimer level. So maybe this D dimer would be an important surrogate for underlying thrombosis, and that could be the cause of the death, though we consider that D dimer is a poor predictor of survival. Let's see what are the possible treatment strategy we have with us. These are the general measures of infection prevention, fluid management, oxygen, invasive ventilation, all these things we have to do. What are the possible therapeutic options we have? These are the possible drugs. None of these drugs, let me say, currently is approved for routine use for COVID-19 management. They are all used on compassionate ground or sometimes on case-to-case basis, or sometimes on based on institutional or national recommendations on a humanitarian ground or an off-level type of indications. So remdesivir, which is a specific antiviral drug, is a nucleotide analog that actually prevents the proteolysis and prevents the replications chain of the virus within the cell. And this has been administered, usually it is an intravenous drug which is administered, and US FDA has approved only on emergency use authorization and compassionate ground. Especially the side effects are elevated liver enzymes and all. That's why somebody who has more than 5 times AST, ALT elevation or creatinine clearance of less than 30 or 50, or if the patient is on another COVID-19 drug, they should not be given these things. This is one of the study in NEJM where 61 patients were given remdesivir. Data was analyzed for 53. 200 milligram of remdesivir was given, followed by 100 milligram for next 9 days. So total 10 days of therapy. And what they found that overall there was some 68% improvement in their clinical parameters as well as the oxygen requirement. However, this is an observational study and a definitive conclusion cannot be derived that remdesivir is the only means by which these patients improved. So the authors also very well concluded that in this cohort of patients hospitalized for severe COVID-19 who were treated with compassionate use remdesivir, clinical improvement was observed in 36 of 53 patients. However, the measurement of efficacy will require ongoing randomized controlled trials of remdesivir therapy. And of course, there are a lot of trials going on for this drug. Chloroquine, this is one of the cheap, inexpensive, readily available drug, and all of us has experience with hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine for more than 50 years now, and this has been extensively used and has been found to be relatively quite safe. Mostly people, especially in the tropical countries like us, this has been used for malaria since decades, as well as for connective tissue disease like SLE, this has been used hydroxychloroquine. So as far as the safety is concerned, this is proven well beyond that they are relatively safe drugs. And these drugs have been found to have some antiviral activity in vitro against the SARS coronavirus 2, which is the causative agent of the COVID-19. However, in human, trials are going on. There is no foolproof trial as of now, but the recommendations are there based on the available evidence from the laboratory, animal model, and other studies. So usually the doses which have been recommended is 400 milligram twice a day on the first day and 200 milligram twice a day for next 4 days if we are using hydroxychloroquine. But at the same time, we must ensure before prescribing hydroxychloroquine, an ECG has to be done and other possible contraindications should be ruled out. And ECG should be repeated also after prescribing hydroxychloroquine, maybe after 2-3 days. And serially, it can be followed up depending upon the clinical signs and symptoms. Also, we should take into considerations other drugs which the patient might be taking and which may lead to drug-drug interactions. There is a small pilot study in 30 patients again from China, where they used hydroxychloroquine in mild to moderate diseases. They used it for 5 days, 400 milligram. And the primary endpoint was the virological clearance from the nasopharyngeal swab tested by RT-PCR. And in this study, they do not found any difference, those who received and those who do not receive hydroxychloroquine. So this was a negative trial. Another study which has been published, I think this is from France, where they enrolled in an observational study of 80 patients, mostly mild to moderate cases they included, not the severe diseases. 3 patients required ICU admission among these. If we see here, what they found, these black bars represents the number of people for whom the test result is available. And if we see these gray bars, this is the number of people for whom the test is still positive. So on day 0, this is 80 patients included. We can see that all the 80, okay, we have the available data, 80 tested and 80 are positive. But as we go down serially, by day 8, we can see that almost the positive rate is less than 10%, somewhere around 8% of the patients only positive. If we go to day 11, then almost only one patient is left who is still positive for RT-PCR. Rest all have become negative. And if we go to day 12, none of the patient is still having RT-PCR positivity. So what they documented here, that a combined use of hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin almost led to a 50% virological clearance by RT-PCR from the nasopharyngeal swab by day 4. And by day 12, it was 0%. None of the patients were found to have RT-PCR positivity. And from this, they proceeded to the same group, another possible small randomized, non-randomized rather, a open level non-randomized trial, where hydroxychloroquine was given 14 patients, combined hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin only 6 patients received, and only chloroquine was given, only hydroxychloroquine was given to 14 patients. So here also, was much faster compared to the control who did not receive either hydroxychloroquine or azithromycin or in combination. So these are small evidence where there is some evidence of prescribing hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine in this group of people. In our country also, our Indian Council of Medical Research currently recommends giving prophylaxis hydroxychloroquine to asymptomatic healthcare worker as well as asymptomatic household contacts of laboratory confirmed cases, and this has to be given 400 milligram day 1 followed by either weekly 7 weeks or either weekly 3 weeks depending upon the indications. Even in US, there was a rapid US FDA approvals for hydroxychloroquine despite lack of evidence, and this was published in an editorial in the BMJ. So what ministry recommends for us as of now, though none of these drugs are approved for routine use, off-label, these can be used. Hydroxychloroquine in combination with azithromycin can be used for management of complicated COVID-19 cases. However, these prescriptions should not be given to patients below 12 years and as well as those who are pregnant women and lactating women. Next is the interleukin-6 inhibitor, the tocilizumab. In this trial, we can see, or rather in this study, we can see that it is a small study involving only 21 patients. After giving tocilizumab, it is usually again given intravenously, 400 milligram on the initial dose. If required, another 400 milligram can be given. Otherwise, mostly it is a single dose of usually 400 milligram or 4 to 8 milligram per kg body weight usually given. So there has been improvement in all the parameters, the laboratory parameters, the clinical parameters, as well as the radiological parameters, and no obvious serious adverse event was noted with tocilizumab. However, all these patients who received tocilizumab in this study also received so many other drugs for COVID-19, including interferon, lopinavir, ritonavir, ribavirin, etc., and corticosteroids. So whether these effects is due to tocilizumab or it is a combined effect of all these medications, we do not know. That's why, as of now, it cannot be recommended unless we have evidence from well-conducted randomized trial. Convalescent plasma is also another therapy which is an experimental therapy. People usually derive this convalescent plasma from patients who have recovered from COVID-19 diseases, especially those who have a high antibody titer in their serum. And in this study, they used around 200 ml of convalescent plasma, and they found that there was significant improvement in the oxygen saturation symptoms by the third day of therapy. However, we also noticed that the median duration from the onset of symptoms to administration of the convalescent plasma was 16.5 days. It was quite late started. If we see the virology, most of the people will have a virological clearance in a week or 10 days. So after that, this may not be having any effect on the virological clearance, but I don't know, it may be helping some way in normalizing the severity of illness. possibly that we will be able to know in future only. Then the lopinavir ritonavir, this is another randomized controlled trial where this antiviral, rather anti-HIV drug was used. And in this study, they do not found any difference between the two drugs. Those who received and those who do not receive, there is no difference in the median time to clinical improvement, as well as the mortality in the group, both the groups were similar. So what the authors concluded that in hospitalized adult patients with severe COVID-19, no benefit was observed with lopinavir and ritonavir treatment beyond the standard treatment. So we need further trials to confirm whether really lopinavir ritonavir is useful in patients with COVID-19 disease. Last but not the least is what should be our anticoagulation strategy. As I have already discussed in my previous slides, there are two large studies which are including more than 150 patients showing there are increased incidences of thrombosis. So there is a guideline, recent guideline consensusly developed by the Society of Thrombosis and Hemostasis, and so many society, you can see in the footnote, has endorsed this, and they recommend that as of now we should continue with the prophylactic dose of anticoagulation, the low molecular weight heparin or heparin, whatever we give in these COVID-19 patients, because there has been, after seeing the increased incidences of thrombosis, there has been a tendency or a thought among the people or clinicians who are managing whether we should give prophylactic or whether we should give empirically therapeutic dose of anticoagulation to these COVID-19 patients. As of now, there is no clear-cut answer to these questions. So this guideline recommends there is insufficient data to consider routine therapeutic or intermediate dose parenteral anticoagulations in patients with COVID-19 disease who do not have DIC. And again, also they do not recommend routine screening for DVT in patients who have a elevated D-dimer level. Similarly, for patients who have established DVT and COVID-19 disease or suspected to be COVID-19 disease, prophylactic anticoagulation can be given if there is no overt bleeding. And similarly, also patients with severe COVID-19 disease who have established DIC but no overt bleeding, there is insufficient evidence to recommend therapeutic dose of anticoagulations. So what the gist of this is that as of now, we should stick to the simple prophylactic anticoagulations unless we have documented a evidence of thrombosis or thromboembolic event in patients who have COVID-19. Lastly, this is our algorithm what we follow in AIIMS Bhubaneswar, that once the patient comes to us, whether he is a suspect or a proven case, then once we consider somebody as a suspect or a proven case of COVID-19, we have to assess the severity, whether he is a mild disease, he falls into a moderate group, or a severe pneumonia ARDS, what we are discussing today. And if the patient is in a mild group, they actually do not need anything except for some simple analgesics, paracetamol, etc. Okay, like a normal flu, but we have to stratify again according to whether they belong to the high risk or the low risk group. If the patient falls into the high risk group, maybe you can consider using some antibiotic depending upon the indications. If you feel the patients might be having pneumonia, or you may consider oseltamivir if the patient has a strong suspicion that it could be a H1N1 like that. And if the test comes positive, then you accordingly you take care. And if the test comes negative, then symptomatic management like a simple flu management, even they can go home and telephonically it can be monitored. And high risk means already we have discussed patients who are more than 60, severe disease, immunocompromised, comorbidities, etc., etc. They are the high risk group. If they are moderate disease and they are not very much oxygen dependent, or they do not have hypotension, maybe we can manage in the ward. But those who are having severe manifestations, they definitely need admission into the intensive care unit. So if we see the severe disease, those who have features of severe disease, please admit them into the ICU, assess the airway, if required intubate, care for the fluid appropriate, manage them with ARDS protocol of ventilations. There is also a controversy whether we should go by ARDS protocol or we should have a different way of managing these groups. That will be discussed subsequently in the subsequent session. And of course, whatever we require, then test them. If the test is negative, then treat them like whether it is a community acquired pneumonia, hospital acquired pneumonia, sepsis as per the available protocol of the institutes. again, this group of patients who have severe pneumonia and who ends up in ICU, initially within the initial 1 or 2 days till you get the positive report or negative report, we may be in a doubt whether they are having secondary pneumonia or this is a manifestations of any tropical fever. So accordingly, you can treat them with either an antibiotic or doxycycline, antimalarial, depending upon the prevalence of different diseases like scrub or malaria in your locality. And if the test comes positive, then as of now, what we are giving is only hydroxychloroquine. As of now, we are not giving lopinavir, ritonavir. We have not given to anybody so far. We have given hydroxychloroquine to 2, 3, 4 of our patients so far. And then you test. Once the patient has improved clinically, then you test the patients. So roughly we do the testing maybe after 4 or 5 days of admissions. You test the patient, and if 2 consecutive tests 24 hours apart comes negative, then they are virologically declared cured. But whether they are suitable for discharge or not, that will depend upon the clinical condition of the patient. If the patient is still requiring invasive ventilatory support or non-invasive support or still requiring some form of hospital therapy, then he cannot be discharged. He has to be discharged only after he has met all the clinical conditions of discharge, not only the virological clearance. So to conclude, what we understand so far that roughly 1/5 of the patient of COVID-19 cases will present with severe illness. Dyspnea and desaturations are the 2 indicators of severe COVID-19 pneumonia. Comorbidities and older age are predisposing factor for severe disease. Thromboembolic events are increasingly being recognized, and there is a dilemma whether to give therapeutic or prophylactic anticoagulations. Currently, no drug is approved for routine therapeutic use, and management is largely supportive. However, remdesivir as an antiviral drug seems to be the most specific antiviral and the most promising antiviral, and we can only know the answer in future. Dear friends, we all of you know that we are going through a very bad phase and we are fighting a war. That's why we are now, all the medical fraternity is being called as a warrior. So you believe and I believe that together we can fight against this war, and together we can, or we will win against this war. We all know that this is a peculiar situation where you are fighting a war, but you don't know or you don't see your enemy. So the enemy is invisible, but the enemy is not invincible. Thank you very much for your patience hearing. Any questions? Hello? Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So dear participants, I will request, I will take up questions at the end of the session of Dr. Misra, because both are related to severe disease management. At the end of both the talk, we will take the questions. You please write your questions and be ready. You can interact with us at that time. Collectively, we will take all questions. You can post your questions here also. Thank you so much. Within 2 minutes, we will start the next session.
So very warm good afternoon to all of you. And after hearing the talk by Dr. Manoj on critical COVID disease, we'll now go on to what constitutes the ventilatory management of patients with ARDS due to COVID-19 disease. So the objectives of the lecture are four broad objectives. I'll tell you how to diagnose ARDS in patients with COVID-19 disease, the management of patients in respiratory distress, what are the infection control practices pertaining to the ventilatory management of patients, and a slide about the prevention of complications of such patients. So I'd like to declare that the images are borrowed from the net, and I have acknowledged them wherever possible. So the background has already been told to you by the previous speaker. Just a recap, around 14% of patients with COVID-19 infection develop moderate to severe disease or pneumonia, which requires hospitalization and oxygen therapy. Of these, around 5% of patients will require admission to an ICU, and 67% of these patients will ultimately develop acute respiratory distress syndrome. Now, most of the patients with ARDS, that is more than 50% of patients with ARDS, will go on to having invasive mechanical ventilation. And as Dr. Manoj had already pointed out, the factors associated with increased mortality are older age, increased mortality, as well as increased risk of developing ARDS. Both are older age, male gender, comorbidities like diabetes, hypertension, and so on and so forth, higher admission, organ failure scores, D-dimer levels, and a higher neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, because there's both neutrophilia as well as lymphopenia. Now, the ARDS usually is quick to happen and usually happens within 1 week of the developing of the symptoms. So at this stage, the diagnosis is presumably made that it's a COVID-19 infection by RT-PCR. And how do you diagnose ARDS is you go for the imaging. Now, there are a variety of modalities for the imaging. You can go for a chest CT or an X-ray or lung ultrasound. Now, in the early phase of the ARDS, an X-ray is neither sensitive nor specific. Hence, a CT is probably more sensitive to pick up the changes in the lung. And as Dr. Manoj has already said, there are it's a bilateral disease. So the ground glass appearance is very typical in the periphery of the lungs and especially in the inferior lobes. But there may be mixed patterns as well. There may be a ground glass appearance. There may be consolidations. There may be dilatation of the radicals, vascular dilatation inside these things. But the problem is that the CT is labor intensive. It requires the patient to be shifted to an imaging suite. And then there is always the risk of infection transmission to multiple people. So a bedside lung ultrasound is almost as good as a CT to pick up the lung damage. And typically on an anterior or lateral lung fields, you will get these B lines. Now the B lines are nothing but comet tail or rocket artifacts. And they start from the pleural line and go to the bottom of the sector. So they traverse the entire length of the scanning sector. And more the number of B lines, more is the lung damage. It's very unusual to see B lines in the anterior or the lateral lung fields. So if you're seeing more than 3 in any anterior or lateral lung field, you're looking at a patient with an interstitial disease pattern. The other thing that is very typical of this disease is that the pleural line becomes irregular as compared to other patients with just presence of B lines. So an irregularity of the pleural line and presence of B line is more specific changes of ultrasound in patients with ARDS due to COVID-19 disease. You also have these hyperechoic subpleural spots, which are subpleural consolidations. And this is also a typical feature of ARDS due to COVID-19 disease. So once you have the imaging, the second step is to look at the oxygenation impairment. So you have mild, moderate, and severe ARDS, depending on the degree of oxygenation impairment. So you typically measure the PaO2 by the FiO2 ratios, and between 300 and 200 is mild ARDS. Moderate is as the PF ratio worsens further, so between 100 and 200 is moderate ARDS, and PaO2 by FiO2 ratio of less than 100 is severe ARDS, and most of the patients will be on mechanical ventilation by this time. If you do not have an outline, if you do not have PaO2, that's fine. You can still go for an SpO2 by FiO2 ratio, and any ratio less than 315, including in non-ventilated patients, is considered ARDS. You cannot quantify the severity of ARDS using the SpO2 by FiO2 ratio. You can just say whether the patient is having an ARDS or not by using a cutoff value of 315. So once you've diagnosed the ARDS, we'll go on to how we manage these patients. So there are three types of management. One is the simple oxygen therapy. The second is the high flow oxygen therapy. And third, which forms the crux of the talk, is the invasive mechanical ventilation. So consider resuscitation with oxygen in a patient with ARDS when the saturation is less than 92% while breathing room air and with obvious signs of respiratory distress like tachypnea, dyspnea, labored breathing, cyanosis, etc. Now, most of the time, you can deliver this oxygen therapy using simple equipment like a nasal prong or a face mask with rebreathing bag. So suppose you're using a face mask, you can start off with 5 to 10 liters. And if you want to use higher flows, say, for example, the patient is still tachypnic or dyspneic despite a face mask, and you want to upgrade to a face mask with a rebreathing bag, go on to flows of 10 to 15 liters that delivers a FiO2 of around 0.4 to the lungs. Now, in the resuscitation phase, it's important to remember that the target saturation should be greater than 94%. And once your patient is improving and more comfortable, the oxygen flows can be decreased to keep the saturations more than 90%. A little bit of recommendation is different for pregnant women. The WHO recommends saturation of 92 to 95% even in the stable phase in pregnant women. Now, if you started your patient on low flow oxygen system and the patient are not improving, they're deteriorating, you can try high flow oxygen systems. But it is important to understand that do not give a prolonged trial of high flow systems. If your patient does not improve with high flow systems within 1 hour, then consider intubating these patients and institution of mechanical ventilation. Now, there are two standard devices. One is the high flow nasal cannula, which delivers flows of up to 60 liters per minute, which is a good modality to use when your patient is acutely tachypnic and with high minute ventilation requirements. The risk of aerosol generation is the same as that of a face mask because these are just high flow systems and high flow oxygen systems, and they are not a positive pressure ventilation system. So there's not very high chance of aerosol generation and contamination of the environment. The other thing is there is a better patient compliance because you have a predictable flow that's delivered to the patient, which matches the ventilatory requirements of the patient and also gives a predictable FiO2. And these gases are heated and humidified, so the patient comfort is that much more, and there is a decrease in the work of breathing. The other advantage of a high flow nasal cannula is that it gives some PEEP to the patient. For every 10 liters, you get 1 centimeter of PEEP. So for 60 liters, you'll get 6 centimeters of PEEP that is delivered to the patient, which can decrease the work of breathing and improve the oxygenation. The contraindications for a high flow nasal cannula system would be multi-organ failure and altered mentation, in which case you should straight away go on to a mechanical ventilation. Now, regarding the other thing, the non-invasive positive pressure ventilation, there is a risk of environmental contamination because you are instituting positive pressure ventilation and the trachea is not secure. So some manufacturers have come up with these kind of hoods, which they purport that there is a less chance of environmental contamination with that. But remember that when you put a hood like this, it adds to the dead space to the patient. And therefore, at this particular point of time, there cannot be a recommendation for non-invasive positive pressure ventilation. So high flow nasal cannula is still okay, but no recommendation for non-invasive positive pressure ventilation. Now, suppose your patient requires mechanical ventilation, 3 main aspects of managing the mechanical ventilation as you look at the tidal volume, you look at the plateau pressures, and you look at the positive end expiratory pressures. Now, till now, we do not have enough data for COVID-19 patients. So the majority of the evidence comes from all the ARDS trials, and the recommendations at present are the same recommendations as that for ARDS. There are very few things that have changed. So in keeping in line with that, there is no particular mode of ventilation that's superior to another because there has been no mode of ventilation that confers mortality benefits. But the key to improving mortality is you go for a protective lung ventilation strategy by using low tidal volumes. So the tidal volumes that are recommended are 4 to 8 mils per kg of ideal body weight. And remember, the ideal body weight is based on the height. So it's a very good idea to have these height weight nomograms inside the critical care units because it will not be possible or practical for you to take a calculator or a mobile device inside these areas and start calculating what is the ideal body weight for a particular patient. So it's always a good idea to hang up these height weight nomograms to decide on what is the ideal body weight for any patient who is admitted to the critical care unit. So the WHO recommends starting the tidal ventilation at 6 mils per kg and adjust the ventilatory rate to keep to approximate the minute ventilation for that patient. Do not go more than 35 per minute because it limits the inspiratory time and it also increases the peak airway pressures. How much hypercapnia to tolerate? Since you are instituting low tidal volumes, it is expected that the PCO2 will rise. The permissive hypercapnia can be tolerated till a pH of 7.3. So from 7.3 to 7.45, you can allow the carbon dioxide to build up. The second important aspect of managing these patients is the plateau pressures. Now the plateau pressures, there's a three-pronged approach. So you start off with a tidal volume of 6 mils per kg. But if you still find that the plateau pressures are more than 30 centimeters of H2O, then you decrease the tidal volume by 1 mil per kg till your plateau pressures are less than 30 centimeter of H2O or your tidal volume has reached 4 mils per kg. Either on a volume control mode of ventilation or on a pressure control mode of ventilation, it's very easy to find out the plateau pressures. All you need to do is just give an inspiratory pause and it will immediately tell you what is the plateau pressure. Coming to the next algorithm, if the plateau pressures are less than 30 centimeters of water and your tidal volume is less than 6 mils per kg, try and increase the tidal volume to 6 mils per kg or till the plateau pressures are more than 25 centimeters of water. If your plateau pressures are less than 30 centimeters of water and there's ventilator desynchrony because of increasing patient minute ventilation requirements, for example, breath stacking, or the carbon dioxide is building up and leading to hypercapnia, which reduces the pH to less than 7.3, then you can increase the tidal volume to 8 mils per kg, keeping in mind that the plateau pressures should not go up more than 30 centimeters of H2O. So the bottom line is that maintain the plateau pressures to less than 30 centimeters of H2O and check these plateau pressures every 4 hours or after you make any change in the ventilator settings. Some specific aspects in children. In children, do not keep a plateau pressure of 30 centimeters of H2O. Recommendation is that you keep a plateau pressure of 28 centimeters of H2O. But the good thing is that children tolerate much higher levels of hypercapnia. So the lowest pH to which you can come down is 7.15. So your permissive hypercapnia works well. Now, depending on the respiratory system compliance or depending on the lung compliance, for children with very low lung compliance, you keep a tidal volume of 3 to 6 mils per kg. If the lung compliance is better, you go for a higher tidal volume of 5 to 8 mils per kg. How do I know the lung compliance? Look at the plateau pressures. Number one, if the plateau pressures are high, probably the lung compliance is not good. Another very good method of evaluating the lung compliance is look at the driving pressures, which is nothing but the plateau pressures minus the peak pressures. If the driving pressures are high, then the compliance is low because the driving pressure is inversely related to the compliance. So try and keep the driving pressures to less than 15 centimeters of H2O. Another thing in children is remember that do not give PEEP of more than 15 centimeters of H2O. Like in adults, you can go up to 24 centimeters of H2O, but for children, you can't give PEEP of more than 15 centimeters of H2O. Now, how do we manage PEEP? Again, there is not enough data in COVID-19 patients, so there can be no strong recommendation. What is the advantage of PEEP is that it just keeps the alveoli open at the end of expiration and prevents de-recruitment of the lungs. The WHO suggests that a higher PEEP, say around 10 centimeters of H2O, may be better than a lower PEEP. So you have these PEEP FiO2 nomograms, which you should also hang up in your critical care units. And your oxygenation goal should be to keep a PaO2 of 55 to 80 millimeters of mercury or maintain a saturation of 88 to 95 by titrating the FiO2 and PEEP. For example, if you start off with let's say if you start off with a PEEP of 10, then you if you're going for this algorithm of a lower PEEP, higher FiO2, keeping your PEEP constant, you can change your FiO2. Or if you're going for this algorithm, if you're going for a higher PEEP and lower FiO2, keeping your FiO2 constant, you can keep on changing the PEEP. So it depends on you, and you have to individualize the management of patients so as to maintain this oxygenation goal. Now, there are some other management strategies that are always an add-on and they help in these patients. One is prone position ventilation. Now, in the supine position, the apex of the lung, that is the non-dependent areas, the alveoli are not collapsed, but most of the alveoli are collapsed at the dependent areas because of the increasing pleural pressure gradient. When you reverse these patients and put them in the prone position, the alveoli that are dependent, they open up, and the same thing happens in patients with ARDS. In ARDS, in a supine position, these alveoli in the non-dependent areas are the ones that are opened, but most of the alveoli in the dependent areas are collapsed. The ventilation is therefore preferentially happening to the non-dependent areas and not to the dependent areas. Unfortunately, most of the perfusion is happening to the dependent areas and not to the non-dependent areas. Therefore, it creates a shunt, and this creates the hypoxemia. Now, when you put these patients in the prone position, the alveoli that are in the dependent position open up. More importantly, most of the alveoli stay patent, and the other important thing is that the perfusion is still happening to the dorsal region, that is to this region, so that your VQ matching improves and your shunt fraction decreases. But the problem with prone position ventilation is you have to institute prone position ventilation for at least 12 to 16 hours to see some benefits. And it also is important because it confers improvement in mortality. Nitric oxide is basically to control pulmonary hypertension that develops and to open up collapsed blood vessels because of the endothelial relaxation factor, and improve the VQ matching and decrease the shunt fraction. But the problem of nitric oxide is there is no clear-cut evidence in patients with COVID-19 disease. Then there is also a risk of rebound pulmonary hypertension once you stop it, and there's a risk of kidney injury, especially if you're giving more than 40 parts per million. Neuromuscular blockade, it's only to facilitate ventilation in case of patient ventilator desynchrony, or for high plateau pressures, or if there is high PCO2, or if you have to prone these patients to for alveolar recruitment. If at all you have to start neuromuscular blockade, it's a good idea to give the neuromuscular blockade blocking drugs as and when required, and not by a continuous infusion. Should you require a continuous infusion, please don't give more than 48 hours by continuous infusion. Now, for patients who have a problem of hypercapnia, which prevents you from employing protective lung ventilation strategies, if your center has it, then venous ECMO is a good choice, which allows you to remove the carbon dioxide and allow for protective or ultra protective lung ventilation. Recruitment maneuvers, unfortunately, no recruitment maneuvers can be recommended at this point of time for COVID-19 patients. Number one, primarily because of the lack of data. And second, also because recruitment maneuvers per se do not confer any mortality benefit. Now, the biggest recruitment maneuver that took place was the ART trial, which unfortunately did not show a mortality. In fact, the mortality was worse in patients who had a staircase recruitment maneuver. And two subsequent meta-analyses after that also do not show any kind of mortality benefits in patients who have undergone recruitment maneuvers. So therefore, again, no recommendation can be made for recruitment maneuvers. So the main thing to do is go for protective lung ventilation with tidal volumes of 4 to 6 mils or max to 8 mils per kg. Keep your plateau pressures less than 30 centimeters and individualize PEEP to maintain the oxygenation goal. Now, some infection control strategies as far as ventilation is concerned. Endotracheal intubation should be carried out by the best possible expert. There's no two things about it. That's because you have to secure the trachea at the first possible attempt. To that effect, use of video laryngoscopes are encouraged over conventional laryngoscopes for the simple reason that a conventional laryngoscope gives you only a 15 degrees field of view, whereas a video laryngoscope gives anything from 66 to 88 degrees field of view. So the field of view is simply wide enough, and therefore the chance of intubating the trachea in the first attempt increases. Rapid sequence intubation is preferred either using succinylcholine, which is commonly available in almost all centers and setups, or rocuronium. If you have it, it's a good choice because it avoids hyperkalemia and muscle fasciculations. But the key message is avoid bag mask ventilation, because it is again generating a positive pressure ventilation in an unprotected airway, which can lead to aerosol generation. What can you do when you are giving these neuromuscular blocking drugs is you can just go for apneic oxygenation. So you set your oxygen flows to less than 5 liters per minute, close the APL valve, and allow the apneic oxygenation to take place. Even that diffuses the oxygen across the alveolo-pulmonary membrane. The key to infection control practices is avoid ventilation disconnections as much as possible. To that effect, use closed suction systems for tracheobronchial toileting, and clamp the endotracheal tube if at all there is a requirement for a disconnection from the circuit. Now, some certain other aids have been described. For example, this is the intubation hood that has been described by NEJM as having a possible protection against cuff dispersal. So basically, it's a transparent kind of polymer, and this is the open end, and the patient is from this side, and the intensivist intubates the patient from this end. So these two holes are for putting your hands through. Unfortunately, this may not work for obese patients, and there can be no recommendation for this kind of thing on a wider ground. The other good thing that I came across is that you have this. Normally, when we put the mask on the patient, we put it in like this. So the thumb is on the bridge of the nose, and the four fingers are holding the mask and the mandible together. Now, the College of Anesthetists and Intensivists of Sri Lanka, they have come out with a good guideline document where instead of holding the mask like this, you cup the mask using your thumb and your thinner eminences so as to plug any gaps between the hand and the mask. And that also prevents aerosol contamination. So this is a very good way to hold the mask. And they say that it should be a two-hand, two-operator bag mask ventilation if at all you do need bag mask ventilation. So this is the way to hold the mask and not this. Prevention of complication. So the idea is to reduce the days on mechanical ventilation, because otherwise you will go on to having other kinds of pneumonia. So give spontaneous breathing trial, anything from 30 minutes to 2 hours. Daily sedation breaks to that effect to facilitate the spontaneous breathing trial. We all know about the VAP care bundles. And here an important message is, if at all you have to go for an intubation, please go for an oral intubation rather than a nasal intubation, because the nose has a good viral load. And if you intubate these patients using the nasal route, chances are that you'll be pushing the virus into the lungs. So it's not a good idea to intubate these patients nasally. 30 to 45 degrees head elevation is recommended, but ventilator circuit, you should change it only if it is visibly soiled for the same patient. And same recommendation goes for the bacterial viral filters. Change it every 5 to 7 days, or if it is visibly soiled, and not as a routine practice. My previous speaker, Dr. Manoj, had spoken about the pharmacoprophylaxis for DVT and VTE. It's basically the same thing. If there is no strong contraindication, pharmacological prophylaxis should be given with low molecular weight heparin. However, if there is strong contraindication to pharmacological prophylaxis, for example, if the patient is having DIC or is in active bleeding, then you can go for mechanical intermittent compression devices. Change the patient position every 2 hours to prevent a bed sore. And if the patient is not showing signs of septic shock, start enteral nutrition 24 to 48 hours after admission to the critical care unit. If there is signs of septic shock, it's always a good idea to delay it, because it will prevent absorption of the food from the gut. In that case, we have to look at other measures like a parenteral nutrition. PPI and Stooge receptor blockers should be given to prevent gastrointestinal tract bleeding due to stress ulcers. No recommendation of one over the other. There are some mortality benefits with H2 receptor blockers as compared to PPI, but then again, there is not enough data for COVID-19 patients, so you can give any one of them. Early mobilization whenever feasible is the rule, and my references are from the MOHFW document for COVID-19 containment, the WHO interim guidance document, and the surviving sepsis campaign document. Thank you so much.
Hello, am I audible? Hello.
Yeah.
We will take up the questions in 2 minutes. Before that, we are just playing a video, a message from the Ministry of External Affairs, a Thanksgiving message. So kindly have the video, then we will take up the questions. Volume 9. Subuni, volume 9. Amuku to subuni. Thanku subutu koto.
Your presence showcases. Good evening to you all and to all Corona warriors. It is my pleasure to see such a large number of participants for our COVID Management eITech program. Your presence showcases our sense of cooperation and collaboration in combating this pandemic together. I would like to thank all of you for participating as well as contributing positively to this exchange of ideas and best practices. India has been reaching out to countries and assisting them in this very difficult period. We are truly grateful for the appreciation that we have received. As Ministry of External Affairs, we are very happy to be implementing Prime Minister Modi's vision of connecting and collaborating in this time of crisis and uncertainty. We hope that the interactions started during this program will be kept alive to assist our region's healthcare community in finding effective protocols and solutions. I would also like to thank our Indian institutes, AIIMS Raipur, PGI MER Chandigarh, and AIIMS Bhubaneswar for organizing an effective series of webinars on relevant and appropriate topics. Most importantly, we at the Ministry of External Affairs appreciate all our doctors and healthcare professionals who have taken time out to engage in robust knowledge sharing in these sessions. We will be continuing our COVID management eITech courses and hope to see more of you to participate and benefit from these webinars. Dear eITech participants and healthcare professionals, please accept our thanks and best wishes.
Yeah. Now you can ask your questions.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. Again, I'm asking the repeat question. Shall we get PowerPoint presentation through email?
It will be uploaded in our website. You can download it from there itself in a day or so.
Till now, we could not get this link in your website. Till now, so many times we have tried. There is no such things in website. So
Yeah, that our technical team will take care of it, and it will be done. Don't worry, it will be done.
Thank you.
Somehow you will get the slides. Don't worry for that.
Hello, Doc.
Yeah, please.
How are you?
Yeah, please tell us your question.
My name is Martha from Namibia.
Thank you so much for participating. Please ask the question.
All right. Well, my question is going to Dr. Manoj.
Yeah.
Doctor, during your presentation, you speak about the severe cases, or So I just wanted to ask regarding the patients who are known as the asthmatic patients who are using inhale or they are on COPD. Can also be treated for COVID-19? I mean, like in terms of giving them extra oxygen?
Can be treated for COVID-19. I didn't get your point. Yeah, patients with asthma or COPD. Yes.
Yes, the patient is an asthmatic patient.
Yes.
So now it comes to protective immunity development after SARS, COVID number 2. I just want to know, can this patient also be treated for COVID-19, or what kind of precautions can be given to these kind of patients in case of being given oxygen? Are the ventilators like safe for them to use?
Yeah, these patients will be treated as like any other patient, except that these patients should be given steroid liberally, because steroids is essential for the recovery of their primary problem. So if there is, that is the only extra thing. Normally steroids, as of now, there is no consensus whether we should use corticosteroids for COVID-19 management, especially the severe cases. But in cases where the patient is found to be COVID-19 positive and he or she otherwise had a disease for which a steroid has an indications like an exacerbation of asthma or COPD, then you should give corticosteroids in addition to all the managements that has been discussed, including the critical care part. You give oxygens, you give invasive ventilations. You should prefer invasive ventilations over non-invasive ventilations.
Okay. Another question, please, Doc, is regarding the pregnancy, delivery, and breastfeeding mothers. Are they also safe to be treated on the emergency of COVID-19?
Yeah, they should be treated, but most of these drugs cannot be given on them. As of now, as such, there are no approved drugs. But whatever we are giving also, these drugs like the hydroxychloroquine and all, as of now, it is not, because there are no studies on such group of patients in any of the trials. So mostly these people are excluded from most of the clinical trials. So none of the safety of these drugs we do not know in them. So maybe they will not receive the drugs, but minus the drugs, all the other supportive care has to be given to them.
All right. Thank you, Doc.
Thank you so much.
Hello, yes, I'm Dr. Malik. Since I'm professor of surgery, so my question is, it may be a childish question, but for us, it is informative. As you said, chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine are given in the late stages of ARDS or in severe cases. Naturally, it should be given by IV only. So IV, you give in IV drip, or how you give it, and what is the rate of IV drip if it is given with IV fluid?
No, as of now, we have given through Ryle's tube only, hydroxychloroquine tablet. So you can give it through the Ryle's tube. Most of these patients will be intubated, means they will be under Ryle's tube. You can give over Ryle's tube. And those who are not intubated, mild to moderate cases can be given orally if they have other severe comorbidities.
And preferably it should not be, it should not be grinded. It should be put in water or some should be melted, allowed to melt it, because grinding is not helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, we should allow the tablet to dissolve in the water instead of grinding it.
Okay, so it will take time to dissolve, I think.
You can prepare by the time.
Okay, because in cerebral malaria, sometimes we used to give by IM or IV also. So I asked this question. Anyway, thank you.
If you are giving chloroquine, it can be given IM also, no issues.
Okay, thank you.
But usually hydroxychloroquine people are preferring, and evidence also supports more hydroxychloroquine than chloroquine.
Okay. So hydroxychloroquine naturally by oral route only. Yeah, by oral route only we give. That's true. Okay, thank you. Very good presentation. Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Malik, for being there in all the 3 days.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other questions?
Cyrus is, I think.
Anything typed? Any questions typed there?
Ask.
So if there are no more questions, then we can close the session. Thank you.
Okay, sir. Okay, thanks. Thank you all.
We extend our hearty thanks to all the participants across the different SAARC countries. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.